What is up, YouTube? Nintendo 64 Fun Time coming back at you today. So, I had a pretty good idea for an episode. I've been doing a lot of stuff about the new Retro Fighters Brawler 64 controller, and I think it's a really important step just for retro gaming, and I think it's a really cool thing that they have done. So, I've talked about it a lot, and I'm going to talk about it just a little bit one more time to transition in to this episode. So it's cool that they decided to bring the Nintendo 64 controller into being more of a modern design. I know one of the big reasons behind the Nintendo 64 controller, why they did this, is because a lot of people didn't necessarily like the setup. They didn't like the trident grip. It felt odd. It was, how do you hold this? There are people that hold it in different ways. You know, the Z trigger is different. You can't hit both shoulder buttons. What am I doing? But for the most part, the games adapted to how odd the controller was. Now, like I said, it had been a complaint for a long time. With the controller being so odd and people just not liking it. I know some people that didn't play the system because they didn't like the controller. Now this was back in like 97, 98 sort of thing. So this was kind of before the age of the internet. Little did we know that there was an amazing Nintendo 64 controller that was only out in Japan, made by Hori, called the Hori Mini Pad. I don't have it because they retail probably for about 100, 150, maybe even more now. And I'll flash a picture up there. That way you guys, if you haven't seen the Hori Pad Mini, you'll kind of understand the setup that it had and how it tried to more modernize that controller to make it feel more like the controllers of the time, like the PlayStation controller, you know, and kind of rearrange everything into just a two-handed controller, kind of like what this is. This looks very much like the Hori Pad Mini, only the Hori Pad was a little bit more squinched together. Oh, I'm stuck in my microphone. So the Hori Pad wasn't available to us in the States, and now they're just way too expensive. So was there an alternative back in the day? You know, now we have this beautiful Retro Fighters controller, but was there an alternative back in the day? There was. It was really weird. They tried to do the same thing that Retro Fighters did, but they just didn't quite get there because they went a little too cheap. Now we enter the Super Pad 64 Plus. They do make a non-turbo version. This is the version that has the turbo controls, just like the Retro Fighters does. So everything that you see here, other than the joystick layout, it's kind of the same thing. Lining up the C buttons all in a row, just like the Retro Fighters one did, and then bringing kind of everything more into the two-handed shape. Now the thing with the Super Pad does that Retro Fighters didn't do was they modernized it by putting, you know, the shoulder buttons and then the trigger buttons all together. What this one did is they did something quite interesting. If you look on the back, this right here is your trigger. So how you would hold this controller, you would hold it like this, and you would almost get that same feeling of if you were to hold the Nintendo 64 controller where you have your finger on the trigger. But this one, you actually have the ability to have both your fingers on the shoulder buttons while hitting your Z. Now this is actually really nice for fighting games, or I'm sorry, shooting games. And I do like the setup, how they have these kind of angled, but they're all in a line. It's almost kind of like how the Saturn pad was, or the 6-button Genesis controller, where they're all in a line, and the buttons are relatively the same size. A pretty good idea for the time. And then another thing that this did so right is this is the best joystick that we could possibly get. This is a little bit bigger, but what's cool is this is a metal joystick, It's got multiple springs on the inside, and there's a ball in here instead of, if you look at the normal Nintendo 64, it's like pivot joints. This is not. This is a ball. Like, I'm trying to think of a controller that actually uses a ball in the middle. It's not like this where you actually have the pad gliding over top of something. It's a physical ball, like a ball and socket in here, and it's so nice. This was the best joystick you could possibly get for the time. The only problem was it's so tiny and it concaves in and it is sharp. It feels really good when you're moving it, but it's sharp. Like, it's almost like the Dreamcast controller, where when you play for a while, your thumb is like, man, this is not comfortable. It's really sharp. You could put a rubber thing on this and make it absolutely fine. The other thing that this didn't quite do well is the D-pad. Now, they had a cool design where it concaves in so you can fit your finger in here and just rotate it. They made it big enough to where you can just rotate your finger, but again, they made it a little too sharp. Now, the shoulder buttons are a little too small, so sometimes they kind of get stuck. And then the Z trigger has the same issue. If they would have made it a little bit bigger, it wouldn't get stuck as much. But this feels, let's see if I can show you how this feels, doing things backwards is crazy, pretty good to hold this. So this is kind of what we had to modernize the controller. But not very many people knew about this. And third-party controllers, other than the Hori pad, were notorious to suck for the Nintendo 64. This one, the jumper pack, sometimes works, barely works, doesn't work at all. The rumble pack doesn't hardly work. This was always the issue for third-party controllers. This always failed. This always sucked in third-party controllers, which is a very unfortunate thing because this had the potential, this had a good idea. It just didn't quite get there. This is the only one that I can think of that actually had turbo controls as well for the Nintendo 64, so that's pretty cool. Another thing that is kind of difficult with this controller that you have to get used to is the joystick is actually slanted slightly. So when you push up, you actually, when I'm pushing straight up, it's actually going slightly into a corner. So you have to get the feeling of almost pushing to the upper right-hand side is straight up. It's a really weird, you'll kind of go up left for a long time until you figure out, okay, I have to actually just angle my finger to get it to go straight up. So this had a good idea, it just had too many flaws. And that is where the Retro Fighters controller comes in. It's so much cheaper than the Hori pad, which is the best Nintendo 64 controller probably back in the day, but it's unobtainable. It's too expensive, and like I said, us here in the States, and if you weren't, if you didn't have access to, Japan hardware, you couldn't get it. So there you go. I just wanted to show you guys the Retro Super Pad Plus or whatever, because it had the right idea. It was going in the right direction. It just didn't quite get there. And it's something I think that's long forgotten for the Nintendo 64. I don't really know anybody who has this or plays with this controller. It did a lot of things right, but it also did a lot of things wrong, and it just suffered from being third-party crap for the Nintendo 64. So that's pretty cool. I just wanted to bust out an extra controller and show you kind of, the differences between what Retro Fighters did and what we had to deal with if you didn't like the Nintendo 64 controller back in the day. Short video. I hope you enjoyed it. I like to bust out the old school stuff every now and again and hope to show you guys something you haven't seen before. So anyway, Nintendo 64 fun time. Please feel free to follow me on Instagram and Twitter. I do a lot of really cool stuff there. Please hit that like and subscribe if you want to do that. I always appreciate it. Nintendo 64 fun time. Be nice, stay positive, always be gaming.